So I've mentioned in your bio these projects that you've been doing in different countries, and I wondered whether to start us off and to introduce yourself more to the people. You tell us about the SHARE methodology, and also share a little bit about your experience scaling this work in different countries and different contexts.
Thank you. And I just wanted to start off with that brief exercise because I am very honored to have the opportunity to be here with you all, and very much looking forward to, at some point, finding the time and space to listen to your stories as well. And I'm very grateful for you listening to mine and hearing into that. And again, I hope this will be the story of many people who have shaped my life and the work we do in SHARE. So SHARE Foundation, we founded it about 10 years ago with this vision of fostering societies that embrace diversity. And that's typically understood as inclusion, which we understand as relationships based on empathy, mutual support, and collaboration. But before, we've done this, we've supported organizations that have presence in over 90 countries to develop what we call a horizontal approach to relationships. And partnered with over 500 organizations in almost 10 years. So, but before I get into what it is that we do, I would love to share this story so that you can fully kind of grasp and get a sense and a feeling of where it came from. So I'm from Mexico, and I grew up in a school of missionaries, grew up in the state of Mexico, which is the state that kind of hugs Mexico City. So very close to Mexico City. And I went to this school of missionaries that aren't supposed to have schools, and they mostly do work in very rural communities, and they kind of took us along the ride, which was a beautiful growing experience for me, as a young girl. And when I was 17 years old, I led my first project, and in communities that I've been visiting for many years. And I feel like you can imagine me, very eager 17-year-old with big plans of what I was going to do in the communities. And I organized this diagnostic trips to these communities, and I'm there very first day, very anxious and very excited. And you can tell I'm a fast talker and talk a lot. And I was in the state of Mexico. The typical thing is you have the house, which is basically a room in which the whole family sleeps, spends the night. And then there's typically a wooden structure where there's a fire inside. The state of Mexico that has a lot of mountainous regions, and it can get really cold. And so the kitchen is this like wooden structure where the fire is. And so we were, just so you can kind of get the sense of where this happened, I'm there in the floor of Angelica's house, who was the Sunday school teacher of the town of Guadalupe that I have been going to for a long time now. And I was sharing all my big plans with Angelica, and with all the patience and love that she had for me. She listened while she was preparing the most delicious soup. And when I finished, she turned around and looked at me in the eye and said, Vero, I'm going to tell you the truth now. When kids from your school first got here, I thought, what are these snobby kids from the city? And she said some other not so polite words other than snobby. What do they think they're going to teach me about how to live my life and what to do here? Like, what do they know about what it is like to, to live in here? She was right. And that was a big aha moment for me. But what she said after was even a bigger revelation. She said, but Vero, then I got to know you and we became friends. And I invite you with open arms to my house every time you come, not because of what you're going to do, not because of what you're going to bring, but because of the relationship that we have. And so I share that with you because that is at heart the inspiration for SHARE. I mean, Angelica, I always love to mention Angelica because she was such a great mentor in my life. She was one of my big life teachers. And for a long time, I wanted to do everything exactly as her. She had 4 children. I've already had 3 and decided, I always thought I wanted to have 4, same as Angelica. I already had 3 and realized that I'm not as patient as her. So in many aspects of my life, I've been inspired by her. But one of the most important things I learned from Angelica was that for any meaningful change to happen in the world, the first thing we need to have are strong relationships amongst the people who are going to together enact that change. And so up until that time, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, got back home, signed out of medical school. We do it differently in Mexico, clearly. It's a pre-med course that you take in high school. Signed out of that, signed into to study philosophy and specialize in ethical development. My parents almost had a heart attack, and decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to understanding what Angelica and I had, this very unconventional friendship that was so meaningful and so transformative for the both of us. So many years later, I found myself doing a master's in applied anthropology and having this very dark research question. I know that y'all don't know me, so I'm just going to say this before I tell the story. I'm not a psychopath. I just had a very dark research question. My research question was, so just to say that, my research question was, I really wanted to understand what needed to happen in a person's life for them to want to exterminate an entire group of people. The reason why I wanted to understand this was because if we have embracing diversity on one side, the exact opposite is genocide. And so I was sent to do research in a post-conflict island in Indonesia called Ambon. Does anybody know Ambon? So it might sound, there you go, Ambon. So they had interreligious conflict between Christians and Muslims. And I was doing research with about 120 kids and teenagers, 2 orphanages, 2 internally displaced groups, and then some groups of kids that were still living with family members. Almost everybody there had lost at least a family member. And I'll tell you the story of ACIC, who was, she was living in the Muslim orphanage. And I'll tell you the story, her story, because she was very expressive. She was living in a Muslim orphanage. And just to exemplify, by the time that when I went, they lived very segregated. Christians and Muslims, they actually referred to the division in the neighborhoods as their own Gaza Strip. There's a lot of linkage between that conflict and conflicts in other parts. And that, yeah, the conflict was, we're going to get to the social justice and peace, but was brought up by colonial inequalities that were created and conflicts that were planted into the community. And they had been fighting for 3 months with homemade weapons. And by 3 months, what most researchers say is by 3 months, they had gotten tired of fighting, but then it was declared a holy war. Lascar Jihad came in, they got funding from other groups, and the conflict lasted 2 more years. So I'm just mentioning that because the international aspect of things is always there, right? And the international narratives rarely stay behind borders. So anyhow, they lived separately, and most kids would when I asked them, do you have any friends from the other religion? They would all answer with this gesture, which I feel is very telling for those in the back. I'm going to stand up. So they would all answer, they would go back and they would go like this. So you can interpret this face as whatever you want, but that was typically the answer. And then when I would ask them why, it would vary from, we're just different, because of the war. And in the case of this young girl in this Muslim orphanage, she was very explicit. She was like, because of the war, like, what are you talking about? Like, why would we be friends? Like, that is very risky. And this one day that I had forgotten to take my hijab to the orphanage, she asked me, are you Muslim? Like, we have been meeting for a lot of, and I never asked you. I was like, no, I'm not. And she backed up in her chair and her eyes filled up with tears. And she looked at me terrified, like she had never looked at me the entire time I had been there. And I just go, is that okay? And by that time, she's like, yes, as long as you don't kill me. as long as you don't kill me, then, and I said, no, well, no, of course I wouldn't kill you. You're my friend. And if anything, I would protect you. And then the tears came out and she hugged me and she just said, I thank you for that. And that fear that she was holding on to was very common to the children that I was working with. Out of all of them, only 3 knew kids from the different religion, right? And so 2 of them, one of them didn't really live there, so he didn't count. He lived in Jakarta, which is the capital. But the other 2 were these twin girls named Elsie and Elsa. Believe it or not, it was very confusing, and they were identical. So I would usually just go like Elsa, and somebody would show up. So Elsie and Elsa were growing up in the Christian orphanage, and their mother had been raped and killed during the conflict. And one of them had seen how this had occurred to her mother. And so they would tell me the same narrative as other children. You know, we were being taught these abstract notions of love thy neighbor and forgiveness and peace. And that wasn't real for us, especially for the twin that had witnessed what had happened to her mother. She expressed that she had deep desires of revenge and felt a lot of hatred and a lot of desires of revenge. And this was pretty common. Life stories. When I would ask them, children, to write their life stories and ask them what their dreams were, many of them would, draw like mosques in flames and people mutilated, and this was common. The difference with Elsie and Elsa, I'm getting to a point here. The difference with Elsie and Elsa was that they were in a border neighborhood. And so they went to middle school with some Muslim girls. And what Elsie and Elsa said was that when they meet these Muslim girls, they hear their stories, they realize that the totalizing narrative they had of like, oh, Muslim people are our enemies, was suddenly non-existent. They suddenly realized that people from both religions had suffered the same way, had done the same atrocities. Yeah. There's a theory that I was researching in which we still use and share that's called narrative mediation. And I mean, roughly very simply put, what it says is that whenever there's a source of conflict, it's because there's a totalizing narrative around the conflict. And just think about it for a minute. Any source of conflict that you have right now, could be anything, could be my boss is so strict and never lets me rest, or whatever it is. And everything that you're thinking about, I'm going to put the sister example because they're coworkers here and I don't want to create tension. Let's just say I say, my sister's so selfish. This is not true. If any of you come across my sister, I will deny this. I know it's being taped. No, but I have a very good relationship with my sisters. Okay, but let's just say I'm like, my sister's so selfish. She never has time for me, Everything that I think feeds into the totalizing narrative. Okay, what Winslade and Monk, who are the people who created narrative mediation, say is that to solve the conflict, what you need is to diversify the narrative. In the case of Elsie and Elsa, it's pretty simple, right? Not all Muslim people, are enemies. Muslim people also suffered, right? And Christian people also did these same things. That was diversifying the narrative. In the case of my sister, it's pretty simple. Oh, you know what? But she's like swamped at work right now. She's having trouble with her partner and her kids are sick. It doesn't mean that she does have time for you or that, or that she, what we typically say and share is that these totalizing narratives serve as the metaphor we use is that it's as if you put on a pair of purple lenses and all of a sudden all you saw was purple, right? That's how a totalizing narrative works. It's not necessarily that they're wrong because there's purple in the world, right? But for those of us who perceive different colors, not everything is purple. So the totalizing narrative is when you take the purple in the world and you say, I'm going to look at everything through that lens. And diversifying the narrative is saying, you know what? This is true and it's valid. There is purple in the world. My sister is not paying attention to me and I need maybe time with her, right? And that is valid and true. However, it is not the whole story. What that gives you is it gives you elements to understand, right? Different and develop different perceptions. Anyhow, going back to Elsie and Elsa and away from the theory. So that within itself, I think is very powerful, right? that you diversify the narrative, that you have this realization. However, what I found the most inspiring thing about Elsie and Elsa was that they shared that they felt that it was only through their friendship with these Muslim girls that they were able to heal from what had happened to their mother. And so I'm sharing that story. And of course, I asked them if I could share their story, because in many ways, their story inspired me then to say, and my colleagues whom I was working with in Indonesia, to say, what if we do this with more people? What if we bring people, very diverse people, people who think of each other as enemies? What if we bring them together under ideal conditions, mimicking the process of how you build a friendship so that they can have those supportive relationships and then transform their dynamic? We did the pilot in Indonesia in 2013, and right after we did the first pilot, 100% of the kids said that they did want to have friends from the other religion right after the camp. A year into it, on September 22nd, International Peace Day, we had this big event. We had been gathering these children with much resistance. Like, this was not an easy task. I'm kind of saying it like, oh, we gathered children. Like we did a summer camp with the kids. And we co-designed everything with people from there. And the kids almost didn't show up at the last minute. And then one of the moms who was co-leading, had co-designed everything with us, convinced all the parents, like, they're coming with me, I am taking care of them. And it is that trust, right, that is needed to gather people, especially in that context. But a year into it, we had organized this big event for International Peace Day, and my colleagues from Indonesia who are still doing this work there, we have a call and they go, they're so excited. I'm like, how'd it go? What did they say in this activity? Us, right? And they go like, they ate our food. And there I am on the other side of the phone going like, Stephanie, I know you're a great cook. Can we talk about the programming now? And she's like, and she notices that I don't get it, right? And she's like, no, you're clearly, let me explain. We've been gathering with them for a year. And Stephanie was Christian. She's like, the Muslim parents had never eaten our food. They didn't know if we were going to poison them. It's ongoing conflict, right? But now, because they have seen the way our children are with each other, they trust each other enough, and they trust us enough to bring something into their bodies and know that they're safe. And so we were talking earlier about what peace means. And I mean, if there's something more tangible than that, right? And then we expanded. We expanded to the US and to Mexico, tackling different forms of discrimination and violence that are present in those countries, and then also sharing the tools that we had found with other organizations that are in even more countries. And I will say, I know that you have a question about it. Should I just go into it? The international bit. I will pass on to Judy Annette for that. And that's what we do and share. That's what we do and share.
Thank you so much. I would just come right back to you. And I'm just curious to see how different was it. So it's Indonesia, the States, and then Mexico. How does that compare? Like, was it the same? What differences did you see? And yeah, if you could speak to that for a minute before we go on.
Okay. And so I made you all like get up and visualize. So I love facilitating. However, I very rarely do that anymore, because even more than facilitating, I love co-designing. I love co-designing with people in place so that whatever it is that we do together is culturally relevant. So the way in which we have done this work of inspiring societies to embrace diversity looks very different in Mexico and even in different communities in Mexico. Like, I'll just give the one example of Punta Chueca, where the nation of the Comcac people is. And so one of our colleagues, she grew up, when I say like she grew up very close to indigenous movements, I mean very close. Like, her dad was the Subcomandante Marcos's decoy, like very close to indigenous movements in Mexico. And the Comcap people live in the desert in Sonora. They were displaced from their land. And I will mention it because of the panel on ecology and peace. They lived in an island and were displaced by the Mexican government into the desert where they have no water, right? And there's only 800 Comcap people left in Mexico. And the conflict that started to rise amongst the Comcap people was so grave that they physically divided into two different communities with a little bit over than 70 kilometers between them. And so Andrea, my colleague, who had been, she's a biologist and works in social justice, et cetera. She and collaborates with Share. She had been working with them on the terms of water, right? And anyhow, we'll get into that. And then told them about the work that she was doing with Share in other communities with immigrants in California. And that's another story, right? And it's different every place that we do it. And they said, can we do that here? And so we always go through this process of like co-designing and changing, right? What it is that we do. We have this one activity where we grab a ball of yarn and a person says, you know, this is what I like to be called more than what I was named at birth. And this is something that I value about myself, and tosses it to somebody else and tosses it to somebody else, until you have like this network, this woven network in between everybody who's there. And we do it as a symbol of how we're all interrelated, right? Whether we like it or not. And we actually like ask some people to raise their hands and pull them really tight, and we can all feel that pull. And the thing is, we can all feel the pull of our actions because we are collective, whether we have the awareness of it or not. And we're always interconnected, whether we're aware of it or not. So just to give that example, we do that activity, but in the Comcaac Nation, they weave these baskets, these very large baskets, and it takes about a year to weave one basket. And so when they did that activity and towards the reflection part of it, instead of doing it with the yarn, the activity was done with the metaphor of weaving the basket. And what happens when one of those threads is pulled, and what happens to the entire basket? And after that, you had the leaders who had not spoken to each other in decades coming together and listening to each other for the first time. So yes, we do it. It has been very different, and we work with communities, we work with organizations, we work with government, we work with companies. That's very different. And we work with schools. Our largest program is with educational systems. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I guess this is a good time to talk about Live Schoolhouse. We're going to shift a bit and talk about how to build equitable partnerships. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your work with Live Schoolhouse, and if there's some key lessons that you can share with us.
Thank you. So Live Schoolhouse was founded by Jennifer DeCoste, who's right there. And we connected about a year and a half ago, right? A little bit more. Yeah, we are both part of 2020 odd generation of social entrepreneurs selected by Ashoka, and we connected during one of their international changemaker summits. And I just saw what Jennifer was doing and wrote her an email and said, we need this, because we are gathering all these people who come from diverse backgrounds. We go through the process of gaining awareness of biases, having experiences to transform them, and acquiring skills of mutual support and solidarity. And then how do we keep getting them together? How do we keep strengthening the community? And the Life Schoolhouse model is the most beautiful process that I have ever found of community organizing themselves, learning from each other, valuing each other, and ultimately being there and standing by each other through everything. And so Jennifer has trained my team. We have replicated the model in Mexico with our Mexican variants. I've seen photos of Life Schoolhouse. We're usually on, it's very different. Let's just say it's different. We're usually on the floor. It's different in Mexico than what the photos look like here in Canada. But it's just been, I would say, and I have offered some trainings and workshops to Jennifer's network of hosts from Life Schoolhouse as well on our perspective of fostering meaningful relationships. The reason why I had y'all visualize and finish up with a big hug and extending is that for me, interconnectedness and healthy relationships, supportive relationships are at the heart of everything. We can talk about concepts all day long, but we experience those, they're either real or they're not in the way in which we relate to each other. And the fact that, do I see you? Do you see me? Do we validate each other? Even though we may come from very different perspectives and backgrounds. So with that said, we have shared tools, we have adapted methodologies, but for me, the most significant thing has been having another social entrepreneur woman who's had the courage to create these frameworks, to invite other people in, to co-create. I feel like something that's very unique about what we both do is that we don't have a cookie cutter, this is the recipe that you must follow approach. We are very much like in and with community co-creating and responding to. And it's a different way of being and a different way of organizing. And so I feel like just the relationship, the friendship, the support that we've been able to give each other, turns out I had never found it in Mexico. And so sometimes you reach across those national borders, you learn new things and you connect from the heart as if you had grown up together since childhood. And that's how I feel about Jennifer over there. Shout out to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for sharing that. I would like now to shift and talk about community engagement. You've touched a bit on this, and obviously you've worked in different contexts. I guess in terms of community engagement, drawing from your work, I want to see if, based on your work and your experience, what do you think makes for an effective but also equitable community engagement? So, for example, you've given an example of your work with Jennifer, but even drawing from your other experience.
How are you all doing though? Like, shake your hands if you're still with us. It's an hour long. Okay, sort of. Okay, yay, thank you for being here. Yeah, community engagement is I think for me, it was always clear that I didn't want to do a thing that was about me doing a thing. I wanted to be a container and a supporter of people doing their own things and walk with them. And we're promoting collaboration, so it only makes sense to me that our process is collaborative and is co-creative. In that very radical sense that with a new group, this definition of wisdom, right? When you go into a conversation ready to learn something, a new truth, prepared to possibly lose what you thought was true, right? So that's kind of my approach on community engagement is that it is about them. And so the way in which people will lead will be different in each, and we will be sharing different practices and different tools, and we will be learning together. And in Share, we very much say that this is a process and not a destination. And so it's basically just what you all did. It's turning around to somebody and saying, I want to get there. Do you want to join me? And let's just walk together. And it's the walk that's important. This was all very abstract. Does that make sense? I will go into particulars of how we do this.
Thank you so much. I guess we can dig deeper there and talk about some specific equity-based methods. So I'm thinking about anti-racist or feminist or even decolonial methods. And we've been having, throughout the panels today, we've kind of touched on them, but I wondered how these three approaches, either one of them, how they shape your work, and if you have like specific examples of how you used them in your work?
Yes, let's go deep. Let's get specific. Like right now, we always work from an intersectional perspective, right? We work from the awareness that, our experiences, our gender is never isolated. We never experience our gender isolated from our ethnicity, from our age, et cetera. Like all of these things are coming together at once and creating very singular and different experiences for each and every one of us. And so we bring that into everything that we do. Right now, the biggest thing that we're working on is in the state of Mexico, which is the largest educational system in our country statewide. In the second state with the highest percentage of gender-based violence and the highest cases of feminicide. So where women are being murdered for being women. And this is a problem. This is a crisis, a war that has been increasing since 2015. It has just gotten worse and worse and worse in Mexico. So in the state of Mexico, and this is the state I grew up in, this is the state that I met Angelica in, like this is where I'm from, where I grew up. It's over 75% of us who live in the state or have lived in the state of Mexico who have experienced gender-based violence. 75%. And those are the official numbers. And we know that the reality is typically quite above the official numbers. So the Secretary of Education asked us to review and revise and advise on a strategy for gender equality through education. And it was one of those academic programs, there is a lot of content. And we offered to invite one person per school. It's 1,160 schools that are serving almost 500,000 students. And so what we offered, this is kind of how we go about, and I will go into, so feminist, anti-racism. I feel like I could go deep into each one of those. We believe in experiential learning. We believe in having experiences that transform you and not just you, but that transform our relationships, because we think that's where it is, right? That's where it's happening, and that's where it needs to change. And we work with a shift of mindsets and then a shift of behaviors. And so we are certifying one person. When I mean certifying is we co-designed with a group of teachers. I like to say with the most outspoken of them. We said, like, this is what we typically do. How should we change this so that you can go to your school and facilitate art therapy and active listening and awareness of bias activities and all of these things with the teachers in your schools to create a different culture, to start cultivating a different culture, a healthy culture of social, emotional, a different form of social, emotional development in all the people in your educational communities. And they have just flown with it, right? They've taken it, we're currently working with 528 schools. We still have 675 schools, which are the most rural ones that we will be working with next semester. But we go through this process. We developed with them a guide of inclusive and exclusive practices, and it's intersectional. So you have gender, race, ethnicity, abilities, etc. And what we developed with the teachers was, how does this show up in your everyday practices? What are the comments that you're seeing with students that now, because we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to call them out? And we're going to be feminists, so we're going to call them out. And what are the inclusive practices? Like, what is the other thing that you could do, right? And so every month, all of the teachers in these 520 schools that we're in right now, but by the end of the year, it'll be 1,000 and many. Every month, they're measuring how these practices, if they're if they're getting better at these everyday practices, if they're getting worse, if they perceive that their students and teachers are getting better and worse, and we're measuring it. We're measuring it and they're measuring it themselves just to increase awareness. So yeah, we dug deep into those with our collaborators, and we've identified how they show up in their specific context there.
Thank you. How are we doing on time and energy? I know it's been a long day. We have a few more things to touch on, and then that's it. Because we've been talking about peace and justice, I want us to focus a little bit on that. And the idea of peace, and I think we've had that throughout the conversations and the workshops in the afternoon. It's a complex idea to sit with in the light of all the things that are going on. So I'd like to hear what you think about the intersection of social justice work, drawing on your work again, and peace and justice. Like, what are your big thoughts about that, and how do we arrive at or work towards peace and justice? It's a big question that we probably don't have enough time to answer, but if you can briefly share your thoughts.
I feel like more than my thoughts, I will just say that because I feel like it has been mentioned earlier today that there cannot be peace without social justice. And typically where there is not peace is because there was social injustice. Like, it's typically social injustice that leads to violence. And so for me, they go hand in hand. And I heard other people mention it throughout the day. So I think I'll just say that I resonate and share that perspective with you all.